Welcome back to Sunday Evening Devotions. Tonight we want to look at 1 Kings chapters 5 through 9, which is the account of King Solomon now being firmly established, building the temple in Jerusalem and his palace. When we think of King Solomon, we often think of the riches of Solomon. I have in my hand these gold-colored coins. These are the presidential dollar coins that came out. They're not really gold. They're gold colored to make you think that we're rich. We're not. Our country doesn't have really gold money at all. But to think of Solomon, he had gold, and the gold was in abundance in his kingdom because of how God had blessed him. So what we find is that David had prepared things for the building of the temple for Solomon. Solomon made then an arrangement with Hiram up in Lebanon to the north, and Hiram from Lebanon agreed to supply Solomon with the cypress trees and the cedar and all that was needed for the building of this temple. And so we find in chapters 5 and 6 then Solomon building the temple. It takes Solomon some 7 years to build the temple. Basically what Solomon does is takes the pattern that God had given to Moses for the tabernacle and enlarges it. Doubles it in size basically. Makes new furnishings for it. Obviously constructs the rooms out of stone and then overlays them with the cedar boards. The cedar boards are intricately carved with shapes of cherubim, flowers, palm trees. The temple is then overlaid with gold on the inside. All this is to reflect the glory of God, but also that God is the God of all of creation. And I think some of this imagery harkens back to the original creation. And all this is the fact that, well, God is the God of creation and over all. And so God promises to dwell with his people in the type and in the picture of this temple. Of course, as Solomon even admits in his prayer of dedication, that no temple can contain God. And certainly this is the case. But we find here that Solomon is rejoicing in all that God has given him to do, and that God blesses it, and God says he will remain with his people as long as they are faithful to him. And we have the sense of the covenant again. So Solomon completes that temple in the 11th year of his reign, and then he begins the construction of his palace complex. The complex is rather lavish. It's very large. There are multiple aspects to it. There's the forest of Lebanon, the 45 pillars from the trees, the cypress trees, where his armory is established. Above that, sitting on 4 pillars, is the great hall. And then there's the entrance where people would be invited into. And then there was the judgment hall after that. And then the house itself that Solomon lived in. And the opposite side of that was then the house that he constructed for his wife, Pharaoh's daughter. And so all this was lavishly done and took him some 13 years to accomplish. And Solomon, we see then the wisdom of how he orchestrated all these things and got them all done. And we think about the palace and the time it took to construct it and all that was involved, we may wonder, well, was this just Solomon using the riches of his kingdom for himself? I think what Solomon rightly understood is that the temple and the palace were connected. In that he, as the son of David, according to the covenant that God had made with David, was the promised heir, a picture of the Christ to come, and that he was the Lord's anointed. And so there is a connection here. The glory of the Lord is expressed in the glory of the King. He is a picture of the King who would come, who would reign over all the earth. And so that's what we find, that this is a reminder of the Jesus who will come to save his people, but a King who will reign over all that there is, because the kingdom is delivered to Christ, and Christ then will deliver all things to God the Father. And so we await that consummation, that true kingdom of Christ, that he said has come, but is yet to be consummated, completed. But in Solomon's day, he was a picture and a type of Christ. And so the glory of the kingdom of God then was expressed through the temple and by his palace. Israel itself was a picture of the kingdom of God on the earth. All the other nations were lost in the darkness of sin. But in Israel was the light of the gospel and the light of God's reign and the promise that it would extend to all the nations, and particularly for Solomon, because his kingdom reached the farthest expanse of all, and he influenced many peoples, as we will see. And so this was all about, then, the picture of God's kingdom, which points us to Christ. So as we think of the riches that Solomon had in gold, and he made gold as common, most as the stones on the streets, God had blessed him. It is not that we have to, we long for physical gold. Rather, it is the riches of God's kingdom that gold represents, that God has promised to us. That's the hope. That's the promise of the gospel. Well, that's good news. Good night.